The wind that morning carried the smell of burning fuel across the fields of eastern Poland. It was just after dawn on July 28, 1944, near the small village of Okuniew, not far from Warsaw. German officers standing near their command vehicles stared through binoculars, trying to understand what they were seeing. Less than 10 minutes earlier, a line of Panther tanks from the 19th Panzer Division had rolled forward with confidence.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
The Panther was supposed to be one of the most powerful tanks on the battlefield. Thick frontal armor, a deadly 75mm KWK-42 gun. German crews believed it could destroy Soviet armor long before the enemy could get close. But now, black smoke was rising from several Panthers. Flames were pouring out of engine compartments. One tank turret suddenly jerked to the side and stopped moving. Another Panther exploded in a burst of orange fire that shook the ground. German officers looked at each other in disbelief. Panthers were not supposed to burn this quickly. Just weeks earlier, the situation had already begun to unravel for the German army. On June 22, 1944, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, one of the largest offensives of the entire war. Soviet forces attacked along a massive front stretching across Belarus. The German Army Group Center, which had held the line for nearly 3 years, suddenly found itself collapsing under overwhelming pressure. Soviet infantry, artillery, and armored formations moved forward day and night. Entire German divisions disappeared in encirclements. Roads filled with burning vehicles and abandoned equipment. Command posts struggled to keep track of units that no longer existed. By late July, the Red Army had advanced hundreds of kilometers westward. Soviet tank armies were pushing toward the Vistula River and the outskirts of Warsaw. German commanders scrambled to form defensive lines wherever they could. Reinforcements were rushed in from other sectors. Among them was the 19th Panzer Division, which had been pulled back from the Eastern Front earlier for refitting but was now thrown into the chaos. The 19th Panzer Division had once been a strong armored force, but by mid-1944 it was a shadow of its former self. Still, it had received some of Germany's most feared machines, the Panther tanks. Many German officers believed the Panther could change the situation. Introduced after the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the Panther had quickly gained a reputation as a deadly tank killer. Its long-barreled gun could penetrate Soviet T-34 armor from well over a kilometer away. The sloped armor design also gave it better protection than earlier German tanks. Panther crews took pride in their machines. Inside the turret sat the gunner, loader, and commander, while the driver and radio operator worked in the front hull. The engine behind them, a Maybach HL-230, produced nearly 700 horsepower. When everything worked properly, the Panther could move quickly across open ground and deliver accurate fire at long range. But there was another side to the Panther that German commanders did not always talk about. The Panther was powerful, but it was also complicated and fragile in certain ways. Its transmission and final drives often suffered mechanical failures. The engine compartment could overheat. Fuel lines and ammunition storage created dangerous conditions if the tank was penetrated. German engineers had tried to improve the design over time, but by 1944, many Panthers still carried hidden weaknesses. These weaknesses were rarely visible during parades or training exercises. On open proving grounds, the Panther looked unstoppable. Crews admired its long barrel stretching forward like a spear. Its optics allowed gunners to see targets clearly at distances where Soviet crews often struggled. German doctrine emphasized long-range engagement, where the Panther's gun could destroy enemy armor before the enemy even knew where the shot came from. But battlefields were rarely open firing ranges. The terrain of eastern Poland was broken by forests, villages, narrow roads, and rolling farmland. Visibility changed quickly. A tank that looked dominant at 1,500 meters could suddenly find itself fighting at 400 meters or less. In those conditions, reaction time became critical. A single mistake could decide the fight. On the Soviet side of the battlefield, commanders had been studying German tanks carefully. Soviet tank crews had faced Panthers and Tigers many times since 1943. They knew frontal armor could be difficult to penetrate, but Soviet doctrine focused on teamwork, maneuver, and striking weak points. By the summer of 1944, new weapons were also arriving on the front lines. One of the most important was the Soviet T-34 85. This upgraded version of the famous T-34 carried an 85mm gun capable of penetrating Panther armor at closer ranges. The turret had space for a dedicated commander, which improved battlefield awareness. Thousands of these tanks rolled out of Soviet factories in 1944. Alongside them came self-propelled guns like the Su-85 and Su-100, designed specifically for destroying enemy armor. Soviet tank commanders also trained their crews to attack from multiple directions. Instead of fighting German tanks head-on, they aimed to flank them, close the distance, and overwhelm them with numbers. Artillery support and anti-tank guns often joined the fight. Soviet reconnaissance units also became very skilled at locating German armored movements before battles began. This is exactly what happened near Okuniew that July morning. The German Panthers had been ordered to counterattack Soviet spearheads pushing toward Warsaw. Around 6:40 in the morning, the German armored column began moving across farmland east of the village. Dew still covered the grass. Thin morning fog hung low over the fields. Tank engines roared as the Panthers advanced in line formation. Inside one of the leading Panthers was Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Baumgartner, a company commander. He had fought on the Eastern Front for nearly 2 years and understood the danger of Soviet ambushes. From the commander's cupola, he scanned the horizon carefully. At first, the fields looked empty. Only distant trees and quiet farmland, the kind of silence that made experienced soldiers uneasy. Baumgartner kept his binoculars raised, watching the tree line on the left side of the field. Something about it felt wrong. The fog was thin but uneven. Shadows shifted between the trees. But nothing moved. Then the first shell struck. It came from the left flank, a sharp crack, followed by the violent impact against armor. One of the Panthers jerked as sparks flew from the side hull. A moment later, another shell slammed into the same tank, this time penetrating the thinner side armor near the engine compartment. Flames burst out instantly. Baumgartner shouted into the intercom for his driver to turn toward the threat, but more impacts followed. Soviet tanks were emerging from tree lines and shallow depressions in the terrain. Several T-34 85s were already maneuvering into firing positions. Within seconds, the battlefield became chaos. Panther crews tried to rotate their turrets and return fire, but Soviet tanks were closing the distance quickly. The Panther's gun was extremely powerful, but its turret rotation was slower than the smaller T-34. In close combat, every second mattered. Another Panther took a hit on its side armor. The shell penetrated near stored ammunition. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Flames shot through the turret ring, and the tank erupted in fire. German radio channels filled with frantic messages. Some crews reported enemy tanks to the left. Others shouted that anti-tank guns were firing from the front. Static filled the airwaves as commanders tried to make sense of the situation. Reports came in that Soviet armor had appeared on both flanks. German tank commanders realized they were not facing a small Soviet force. This was part of a much larger armored push. At roughly 6:47, the 3rd Panther burned. The Soviet attack had been carefully prepared. Soviet reconnaissance units had tracked German movement during the night. Anti-tank guns were already positioned in hidden locations. When the Panthers moved into the open fields, they entered a kill zone. From the German command position several hundred meters back, officers watched through binoculars as one Panther after another stopped moving. Some were hit by tank fire. Others were struck by concealed 76mm and 85mm anti-tank guns. In less than 10 minutes, several of the division's most powerful tanks were burning. German officers struggled to understand what had gone wrong. Panthers were supposed to dominate Soviet armor at long range, yet here they were, losing tanks rapidly. The truth was simple but brutal. The Panthers had been caught in a well-planned ambush. Soviet commanders had learned to exploit the Panther's vulnerabilities. Its side armor was significantly thinner than its front. The engine compartment was also a dangerous weak spot. When penetrated, fuel and hot engine components often ignited quickly. As Soviet tanks maneuvered around the German formation, they aimed precisely at those areas. Meanwhile, Soviet infantry with anti-tank rifles and explosives moved closer to damaged vehicles. Smoke and fire spread across the battlefield. Inside Baumgartner's Panther, the situation became desperate. His gunner managed to knock out one T-34 with a well-placed shot at around 500 meters. The Soviet tank erupted in flames. But before Baumgartner could celebrate the hit, another Soviet shell slammed into the side of his Panther. The impact threw everyone inside the turret against the steel walls. The loader shouted that fuel was leaking in the engine compartment. Baumgartner ordered the driver to reverse behind a small ridge, but the engine began to sputter. Moments later, smoke filled the interior. Baumgartner gave the order every tanker fears: abandon the vehicle. The crew climbed out through the turret hatch and ran across the field as their Panther began to burn behind them. Scenes like this were repeating across the battlefield. Some Panthers tried to pull back toward the road behind the field, but maneuvering under fire proved extremely difficult. One tank threw a track while turning sharply to avoid incoming shells. Another Panther's engine failed just as its crew attempted to retreat, leaving it exposed in the open. By 700, the German counterattack had already collapsed. Several Panthers were destroyed. Others were immobilized with mechanical damage or thrown tracks while trying to maneuver under fire. Soviet forces continued pushing forward, using the chaos to break through German defensive positions. For German commanders, the loss was shocking. The Panther had been designed as Germany's answer to the T-34. It had superior optics, a more powerful gun, and better frontal armor. On paper, it should have been the dominant tank. But war rarely follows paper calculations. The Eastern Front in 1944 had become a battlefield of massive scale and constant movement. Soviet forces were now experienced, well-supplied, and highly coordinated. They had learned through years of fighting exactly how to defeat German armored formations, and they were using those lessons with brutal efficiency. Reports from the battle reached higher German command later that day. Officers studying the situation struggled to explain how Panthers had been lost so quickly. Some blamed poor positioning. Others pointed to lack of reconnaissance. But deeper problems were becoming impossible to ignore. By mid-1944, Germany no longer had the strategic advantage it once held. Fuel shortages limited training and movement. Replacement crews often lacked the experience of earlier years. Panther tanks themselves required careful maintenance, which became difficult during rapid retreats. Meanwhile, Soviet production was reaching extraordinary levels. Factories in the Soviet Union were producing thousands of T-34-85 tanks every month. Even when Soviet units lost tanks, replacements arrived quickly. German armored divisions could not keep up with that pace. Still, German tank crews continued to fight. In the days following the battle near Okuniew, more clashes took place as German forces attempted to slow the Soviet advance toward Warsaw. Panthers and Panzer IVs fought alongside infantry units trying to hold defensive lines along roads and villages. Sometimes German tanks achieved local success, destroying several Soviet vehicles before withdrawing. But the overall situation was turning against them. The battlefield had changed. In earlier years of the war, German armored tactics emphasized speed, coordination, and surprise. Units like Heinz Guderian's Panzer divisions had shocked Europe with rapid breakthroughs, but by 1944 those advantages had largely disappeared. Now, German forces were fighting defensively against an enemy that had mastered many of the same techniques. The burning Panthers near Okuniew became just one example of a wider pattern. Throughout the summer of 1944, German armored units reported heavy losses when caught by Soviet ambushes or overwhelming numbers of tanks. Even powerful machines like the Panther and Tiger could not compensate for the strategic imbalance. And yet, inside those tanks, crews still faced the same terrifying reality every time the hatches closed. Steel walls, only a few centimeters thick, separated them from the battlefield outside. When a shell penetrated that armor, the result could be instant fire, exploding ammunition, or thick smoke filling the interior. For many Panther crews, the fear of fire became one of the most haunting parts of the war. The Panther's ammunition storage and fuel systems created dangerous conditions if the tank was hit in the right place. Crews knew that a single penetrating shot could turn their vehicle into a burning trap. That is exactly what German commanders saw on that July morning. Flames rising from tanks that were supposed to be nearly unstoppable. From a distance, the black smoke columns looked like markers across the fields. Each one represented a crew forced to escape, wounded soldiers, or men who never made it out. As Soviet forces continued advancing westward, the battlefield moved further toward Warsaw. Within days, the Red Army reached the eastern banks of the Vistula River. German units scrambled to build defensive positions around the city, but the shock of those burning Panthers remained fresh in the memories of many officers. It was a moment that revealed a deeper truth about the war by 1944. Technology alone could not decide the outcome. Training, numbers, coordination, and timing mattered just as much. The Panther was still a formidable tank. In the hands of experienced crews and under the right conditions, it could dominate enemy armor. But when caught off guard, when attacked from multiple directions, when outnumbered and isolated, even the most advanced tank could burn in minutes. And on the fields near Okuniew, that is exactly what happened. German commanders who watched those flames rise that morning never forgot the sight. They had believed their Panthers would stop the Soviet advance. Instead, they watched them disappear into smoke and fire as the Red Army kept moving west. The battle lasted less than an hour, but its message echoed far beyond that field. It showed how quickly the balance of power on the Eastern Front had shifted. For years, German armored forces had been feared across Europe, but by the summer of 1944, even their most advanced tanks could be trapped, surrounded, and destroyed in minutes when facing a well-prepared enemy. And as the smoke drifted across the Polish fields that morning, the war continued moving west, leaving behind the burned steel remains of Panthers that once symbolized German armored power.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.